Okay, picking up where we left off, we were just talking about the emergence of the Whigs, how they're coming in opposition to Andrew Jackson. And so I told you that they'd be the major opposition party to the Democrats from about 1834 to 1848. And that's because there's an election that occurs in 1848 that is showing an even more drastic divide, this issue of slavery and sectionalism, our main subject for the week. You're going to see that both the Democratic and the Whig parties by 1848 are splitting almost perfectly along regional lines. The Whigs are not as powerful in the South as the Democrats are, and so the Whigs are becoming a little bit more associated with the North, but there's still a lot of just regional factionalism within both political parties. The Whig Party, after the election of 1848, is almost going to collapse completely because they can't keep any unity because they have Southern Whigs and Northern Whigs, and they never agree on anything because of this issue of slavery. Now, the politicians are still sort of operating under something we've talked about in the past that your textbook talks about. That's the gag rule. And basically what that is they're trying to avoid the issue of slavery altogether. They know that this is a political death sentence because no matter what you say about slavery, you're going to upset at least 50% of the country. And so a lot of politicians, their attitude towards slavery is, I don't want to touch that. That's going to be a really ugly thing for me because I'm going to lose support as a result of it. No matter what I say, you can't really be right. But the institution of slavery now is creeping westward, and it's something that American politicians can no longer ignore. They have to start dealing with this issue. And one of the main events is something we talked about last week, and that is the gold rush and the ensuing flood of 49ers into California. Because in 2 years, California gets enough people to apply for statehood, which they're going to do in 1850. So if you're moving along with me through the lecture slides, that brings us up to this issue. What we're really dealing with is the issue of slavery as it moves westward, and that brings up the Compromise of 1850. When California applies for statehood, they say, we don't want any of the issues that slavery brings elsewhere. We don't want to deal with this issue in the future. So frankly, we want to be a free state. And so California sits outside of that Louisiana territory, so it's not governed by the Missouri Compromise. And so this is another major political crisis. And Congress wants to, again, they realize what it means to deal really with the issue of slavery, and they know that that means war. And they're trying to avoid that. So every time the issue comes up, they want a compromise. And that's what the Compromise of 1850 is all about. It was mainly forwarded by two politicians, Henry Clay, again, the guy who brokered the Missouri Compromise in 1822, and an Illinois Democrat by the name of Stephen Douglas. So, under the Compromise of 1850, California would be allowed to enter the Union as a free state. Texas, that's a win for the abolitionists and the North. Texas is going to be cut down. If you remember looking at during the lecture on westward expansion, Texas gets shrunk into its modern day boundaries that we're familiar with today. They have to surrender their claim up to New Mexico and any lands north of the Missouri Compromise line. But they would be allowed to maintain their holdings in the Panhandle. So those are two victories for the North. And as with all good compromises, both sides are going to get something out of this. Now, the Southern congressmen are going to be able to reject the Wilmot Proviso. And this is a huge win for the South. If you remember what the Wilmot Proviso said, it said anything that was acquired from Mexico after the Mexican-American War and the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, those areas can't have slaves under the Wilmot Proviso. So the South is going to get this Wilmot Proviso overturned. They'll be able to reject this. And so that expands a whole lot of new territory up to slavery. That's a win for the South. In addition, they have to now come up with a way to sort of negotiate slavery in these new territories. Just getting rid of the Wilmot Proviso doesn't mean that slavery is going to be legal there. It just means that now it can be legal there. And so as a way of sort of dealing with this issue of how do you figure out if it's going to be legal or illegal in these new territories, they turn towards popular sovereignty. That's another issue we talked about during westward expansion. But popular sovereignty is the idea, it's a brainchild of a politician from Michigan by the name of Lewis Cass, and it basically means the people who move into the territory will vote on whether or not they want slavery or don't want slavery. But that is going to be a major victory for the South when they get the Wilmot Proviso overturned. And then finally, the biggest issue to come out of the Compromise of 1850. I'm getting my compromises confused. Don't do that on the exam. But with the Compromise of 1850, in an effort to appease Southern slaveholders, they are going to pass a stricter and much more pervasive Fugitive Slave Act. This is what the Southerners have been pushing for about the last 3 to 4 years, ever since the mid-1840s, kind of. They keep seeing runaway slaves and slave sheltering in the North as this huge problem. And so, ultimately, what happens with the Missouri Compromise is it's going to lead to a bigger change in what's happening for African Americans living in the North, people who are escaping slavery in the South and running to the free states. Just to finish off what we're talking about with the Compromise of 1850, before we take a closer look at the Fugitive Slave Act, New Mexico and Utah territories, once they get enough people, would then be deciding the issue of slavery through popular sovereignty. They would be voting on it. Now, as a spoiler alert, that's not going to happen. They don't get enough people in those territories in order to vote on the issue of slavery until after the Civil War anyways. So slavery's kind of been worked out by that point. Now, if you're following along with me here on that map, it's showing you that California is now entering into the Union as a free state. You're looking at the area that's being given up by Texas there as well, showing us how our state here got its modern boundaries. So they're giving that up, and that's a win for the North. But for any African Americans who are trying to run from the orange section of the map to the green section, life is about to get a whole lot worse under the passage of these fugitive slave laws. Now, it's important to understand fugitive slave laws have been in existence throughout the entire run of the United States' history. They've been in all throughout the 19th century. The original Fugitive Slave Acts were passed as part of the Constitution, saying that slaves are property and they need to be returned if they end up getting away and escape to the North. Now, here's the thing, is the North never really followed the existing fugitive slave laws. And the existing fugitive slave laws were not very effective if you were a slave hunter or a slave owner. It was almost impossible to prove who was a runaway slave and who was a free African American living in the North. They had to go through a really rigorous process to prove that this is in fact the individual that got away. Remember, we're living in the era before flash photography. And slaves, even once that existed, they did not readily have a whole lot of pictures of their slaves. So you can't just go and say, yep, that's the guy right there. I've got a picture of him. So they're having to prove it with documentation to say that this is in fact the slave that got away from my plantation. He needs to be returned, or she needs to be returned. So even if you were able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that that is in fact a runaway slave, you still had to convince a Northern jury to return that slave to slavery, and Northerners never voted for that. The Northerners who sat on those juries would say, nah, your evidence is a little spotty. But really, it's just because they don't want to put anybody back into slavery. They don't agree with the system. So, under the Compromise of 1850, this new Fugitive Slave Act is going to be passed. These laws would ease restrictions on slave hunters, and they would compel the federal government to help, and state governments to help in returning fugitive slaves to their rightful owners. Now, it also requires average citizens to aid in identifying and capturing any runaway slaves during this time period. And if they don't do that, they face a pretty hefty fine or a potential jail sentence. So now this act is threatening Northern people, saying that if you don't cooperate with returning slaves to the South, then ultimately you might end up in jail, or you might end up losing a lot of money and paying this fine. To give you an example of how these laws are sort of structured, rather than going in front of a Northern jury to prove whether or not somebody is or is not in fact a fugitive slave, they're now going to just simply go in front of a magistrate or a judge in the North. And a federal magistrate would be overseeing these cases. But as part of this new Fugitive Slave Act, they make corruption in order to sort of favor the slave owners and favor slave catchers. They say if you choose to send, as the magistrate, if you choose to send somebody back down into slavery, you get paid $10. If you choose to say that's not the guy and he's not the fugitive slave, then you only get $5. So they're offering you double the amount of money to return people to slavery. What starts to happen under these laws is that people who were actually never slaves, they were born free and lived in the North their whole lives, some of them are being captured arbitrarily, and just because they go in front of a corrupt magistrate, get thrown into slavery for the first time in their lives. They were never slaves. They were never runaways. And so this is a very pervasive law that impacts what's actually going on in the North. The North is looking at this now because they're saying, look, this is untenable. We can't deal with this. They hate these laws because what this is doing is it's making them complicit in the institution of slavery. What the North is now looking at is it was easy to sit back and go, yeah, I hate slavery and I hate slave owners and I hate the whole thing. But it's all the way down there in Alabama and I'm here in Michigan. I don't care. It's not my problem. It's not in my face every day. Now, slavery is spilling into the North as a result. So if you're looking for the importance of these fugitive slave laws, the importance of these laws are that it's making Northerners be complicit in an institution they just simply don't agree with. And so this is really putting a lot of pressure on people in the North. They cannot abide by these laws. So abolitionists up there refer to this law as the Bloodhound Act. And this is, it might kind of pass you by if you're reading through the lecture slides and go, all right, so what? They called it the Bloodhound Act. This is meant to denigrate and insult the slave catchers. What they're essentially saying by calling this the Bloodhound Act is that you slave catchers who come here to the North and drag people back for your slave owners, you're nothing but dogs. You're a bunch of dogs who work for your master. They sick you on these fugitive slaves. They sick you on African Americans in the North, and you just like a dumb dog go along and do their bidding. So it's meant to really insult the slave catchers and say, basically, you're just a pawn or a tool of the slave owners in the American South. But these laws are critically important. And when you go to the next slide, you can see a political cartoon on the right of a woman carrying her baby trying to run away from slavery. And there you have Stephen Douglas and Henry Clay, the people who passed this compromise of 1850 and allowed the Fugitive Slave Act to be passed. Now they're running after her with a bloodhound at their feet. On the left, you're seeing a flyer that was passed around Boston, and it's telling African Americans in the city to be careful because there's slave catchers now on the loose in the city, and that the local authorities, the police, the watchmen, they are now compelled to help these slave catchers return people to slavery. So the North, as you can probably already sort of tell from what I've been talking about, is going to fight against these laws at both the federal and the local level. At the federal level, they don't have much luck, but at the local level, they do. A lot of areas in the North pass what are known as personal liberty laws all throughout the 1850s. These laws say, I don't care what the Fugitive Slave Act says, these magistrates are dirty, they're corrupt, they're greedy, and they're taking the money. They're not really following law and justice. And so these laws would require on a local level for any fugitive slave who's being accused of running away, they have to go in front of a Northern jury. And it puts the decision in the hands of Northern citizens, not in the hands of a magistrate who gets paid more money to force people into slavery. So the state legislature of Wisconsin is really critically important here. Wisconsin actually nullifies the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This infuriates the Southerners, and it puts that issue that we've been dealing with all throughout the class of states' rights versus federal rights back on center stage. Because essentially what Wisconsin did is said, this is unconstitutional and we're not going to follow it. Yeah, it's a federal law and we're technically compelled to follow federal laws, but we don't recognize this act here. They ended up getting sued by the federal government and they're forced to overturn their nullification of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1859. But they do put up a valiant fight in this issue over the fugitive slaves. the whole epicenter of this issue, fugitive slaves, as we're going to see in a slide or two here, this becomes a hot button issue in the middle of the 19th century. The South is convinced that there's millions of runaway slaves living up in the North, when that's not really accurate or the case. But what's really going on here is there's one particular area of the United States, particularly of Michigan, that's going to cause the Southerners to become infuriated over the issue of fugitive slaves and cause them to kind of blow this out of proportion. And that's Cass County, Michigan. They're at the center of this furor over fugitive slaves in the mid-19th century. The majority of Cass County in Michigan, their white population there, they're Quakers. This is a really, even to this day, this is a super rural area of Michigan. That's my home state. I've been through the area many times. You would not, especially in the middle of the 19th century, you wouldn't expect to go into Cass County and see a large population of African Americans living there. It's kind of just a small white farming community. But if you were to go there in the mid-19th century, you would see a huge population of African Americans living there. And that's because the Quakers in Cass County, who are abolitionists, they welcomed a lot of fugitive slaves who ran away from areas in Kentucky into their community. And so if you were to draw a line up the map, essentially what you would see is if you're going directly north out of Boone and Bourbon County in Kentucky, you end up in Cass County, Michigan. And so that's where a lot of these slaves are resettling. When the slave owners in those areas become aware of this, they send slave catchers back up to try to reclaim these slaves between 1847 and 1849. Now, when they do, the local population rallies around the African Americans and they threaten the slave catchers. Now, the Quakers are pacifists, but the non-Quaker white population of Cass County stands out there with rifles and they cut off the slave catchers and they say, if you think you're going to return somebody back into slavery on our watch, that's not going to happen. You're going to leave here with a bullet in your back. And so their attempts to try and get these slaves back failed. And that's what makes the South, when the Compromise of 1850 comes around, they are going to demand the Fugitive Slave Act be passed. This is why they're so adamant about this issue of fugitive slaves, because of this connection between Kentucky and Michigan and this sort of fervor about fugitive slaves in the 19th century. So the Underground Railroad, obviously this is kind of a nice segue into the discussion of the Underground Railroad. And this is something that is sort of dovetailing with our discussion of escaped slaves. Obviously, the Underground Railroad is the mechanism by which a lot of people are leaving slavery and traveling up north. It's important to understand it's not an actual railroad. I know most of you don't think that, but let's just get that clear. I don't want to see that in the exam. But what the Underground Railroad is, when you're looking at the maps on that slide there, it's slaves just taking the easiest pathways and the pathways of least resistance out of the slaveholding territories of the United States. So the Underground Railroad, you have conductors, people like Harriet Tubman being the most famous one. But what they do is they will lead people throughout through the southern states and the slave-owning states. They're going to take groups of escaped slaves and they're going to have them travel mostly by night, and they're going to stay in safe houses with people that they know are in support of abolition and who are against slavery. And they use coded messages, usually with pieces of quilt with symbols on it. And they tack them up to trees and houses. And a white person who doesn't know anything about the Underground Railroad would look at it and not think anything of it. But that's a symbol to the people, saying this is a safe place to come. You can take shelter and hide here as you continue up north. Other symbols would say, be careful, there's slave catchers in the area. Or get your stuff packed up and get ready to move, we're going to move soon. So obviously the Underground Railroad is a very effective way in which northern African Americans were able to escape to the north. Now this issue of escaped slaves is a major one that we can see tearing the country apart with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. But there's a really profound break in perception and reality when it comes to the freed slave populations living in the North at this time. As I mentioned, the fire eaters, the pro-slavery South, they think that there are just millions and millions and millions of freed slaves living in the North, escaped slaves. The fact of the matter is there's only about 1,000 slaves escaping the South every year. So the numbers are really small. Between 1848 and 1860, 1,000 people leave a year. During those years, there's about 4 million total slaves living in the nation. So those numbers are really, really small. But what the South is going to say is they say, here we go again with those race traders in the North. The same way they reacted to the slave rebellions that we've looked at in the past. They're going to greatly exaggerate this number of escaped slaves in the North and say, here are Northerners promoting our slaves. They're telling them to run away. They're helping them run away. And they're sort of advocating and helping these escaped slaves, and that's against the law. They're stealing our property, essentially. And so there's this really drastic break in how people are dealing with this issue of escaped slaves and how they're seeing it versus how it actually is. So this seems like a pretty neat place to wrap up my lecture right now, this little mini video lecture, and we'll pick it up and start talking about some of what's going on with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the next major event dealing with slavery and sectionalism in the United States in the mid-19th century.